Hello everyone, it's great to see so many people here today. I'm just going to jump straight into it because I know we're going to be tight in time and you're going to be peeling me off here if I try to get through everything in the short 10 or 15 minutes that we have to give you a brief introduction. But my role today is to kind of explain the broader context about why we're here, because following me there's going to be a lot of specific information about what we've been working on the last 12 months and we're going to focus, you could say, on a very specific part of the Heat Roadmap Europe project. But behind the specific parts we'll focus on today, there's a broader story, and you heard maybe Eva refer to it too, and Paul in their presentations, that a low carbon heating and cooling system in the future is about a lot of knowledge coming together in many different ways. And I want to give you a flavour of all of that different knowledge and how it's working out. You could say my background is in energy planning. It's not in heating and cooling specifically. And I want to just start by giving you an idea about how we imagine the energy system is going to change in the next 20 or 30 years as we go towards this decarbonisation. And to do that, I need to start with what this energy system looks like today, because we can only talk about what changes we need to make if we understand what it actually looks like right now. And if we look at today's energy system, and this is a very, very simple overview of what the energy system looks like, and many countries have moved beyond this structure, you could say. But what you can see when you look at it is we have, let's say, 3 or 4 key demands: transport, electricity, heating and cooling. And all of those have historically, in most countries at some point, almost exclusively been supplied by some form of fossil fuels. And one of the key things that you'll notice here is the sectors are very isolated from one another. In other words, in a lot of countries, the people who look after heating never really mix with the people that look after with the electricity. And the transport people are often not even in the energy department, even though they make up so much of it. And this is one of the most fundamental changes that we envisage happening in the next 20 or 30 years. Because in order to get to a low carbon energy system that's affordable for all of us and uses a sustainable amount of resources, we need to start connecting these sectors in a much more systematic way with one another. And the reason that we need to do that is because it makes the system more efficient, be able to use more renewable energy. And that's the 2 key points I want to just demonstrate to you today before we go down into the details of the data. How this sector coupling is so fundamental in allowing us to become more efficient and use more renewable energy. And another point I want you to keep in the back of your mind while I explain that is, in a scenario like this, where we've managed to couple the energy system together, heating and cooling is no longer just an isolated branch of our problem. It's as much of an influence in the heating and cooling sector as it is on the electricity and transport sector. In other words, this is one energy system, not 3 separate components that we need to fix in isolation. So to begin, I just want to give you an example of how efficiency can be improved dramatically, and afterwards give you a sense of how renewable energy can be increased significantly. And the example I'm going to stick to with efficiency is very much building on the work that the guys will present later in the PETA-4 Heat Atlas. Because when we developed PETA-4 over the last few years, the potential to increase efficiency is unbelievably enormous. And today you're going to get a sense of some of those opportunities. Because I know when Eva mentioned energy efficiency, she was very much referring to it in the sense of improving the insulation levels in the buildings. But when you look at the energy system and we talk about efficiency, there's enormous opportunities to improve efficiency on the supply side as well as on the, let's say, building side or demand side. And I'm going to take one example we got in some previous PETA maps that we made before the 4th version, which you'll see today. And this is just taking a random city in the UK, Middlesbrough, where when we developed the data that we'll show in the PETA-4 maps, we found enormous potentials to start using much less energy than we currently use at the moment. And what the PETA-4 maps will show you, and the guys will go into this in more detail in the next presentation, is that the heat demand in this city is 10 petajoules per year and is almost entirely met with natural gas today. But at the same time, just down the road, less than 10 kilometres away, there's a whole bunch of industrial plants, waste incinerators and power stations that currently waste 35 petajoules of heat. So that's 3 times more than the city needs to heat itself. And in a world where we're trying to figure out how to use less fossil fuels, this seems like a pretty good start. Stop burning fuel to produce a product you already throw away just down the street. And this is what the PETA-4 heat maps really visualize and make it possible to see when we put it onto an interactive atlas like the guys will present later. And when we looked at these type of, let's say, situations in Heat Roadmap Europe 3, which was the part of the Stratego project that Paul referred to, the crazy thing is that this was not just something that was possible to do in Scandinavia or some Eastern European countries. The potential to expand this across all EU member states seems to be very, very large. And these are the 5 countries that were part of Heat Roadmap Europe 3. And you can see in countries like Italy and the UK that currently have no district heating other than a small few fractions, you could supply around 60% of the heat demand with economically viable district heating systems when we looked at where the plants were located, where the heat demand was located, and how big the heat demand was within these concentrated areas. And of course, maybe it's unrealistic to say that in the next 30 years we'll get quite that far. But what it definitely says from what we pick up is that we need to be doing as much as we possibly can over the next 30 years to get as much of this opportunity as we can possibly get. Because the limitation will be not on what's viable, it'll be on how fast we can actually implement it. And then the even crazier part about all of this is that when we look at countries that already have high levels of district heating, we can see that there's a direct correlation between more consumption of renewable energy also. So what this graph here shows us is the amount of district heating versus the amount of renewable energy is on an upward trajectory if we compare all the different member states around Europe. So we have this scenario where we have a huge opportunity to increase efficiency. We can use a proven technology, and it can be used in excess heat for now, but that same technology has countries that have already used it to get highest levels of renewable heat in Europe today. So it's proven, it just needs to be implemented in more member states. And to me, that's a huge low-hanging fruit to get a more efficient energy system around Europe. Then in terms of renewable energy, of course there's some, let's say, obvious ones that you can imagine being used on a district heating system, like, for example, solar thermal or geothermal or burning bioenergy and so on. But something that's not so obvious to people is how you use more wind and solar power with the introduction of this district heating. And to give you an example like that, I want to go back to my coupled energy system of the future that hopefully someday we get more closer to. And I just took one of the examples of how the sectors can be coupled together. And if you imagine a situation following this diagram where you have an extra production of wind power on a windy day, if you then switch on a heat pump, that heat pump can convert that excess electricity into some form of heating, which can be stored in a thermal storage tank or provided to the end user. So this sector coupling is not just about us being able to get more efficient plants, it's about being able to use more sectors to balance the intermittencies that we get from things like wind and solar power. And this is so fundamental when we do our calculations, because when we look at the price of storing energy in different forms, this diagram, just our comparison, shows that thermal storage is much cheaper than electricity storage, and centralized storage is much cheaper than individual storage. So the more we can get towards these large thermal storage facilities, the more flexibility we're not just creating for heating, but also for the electricity sector. And this is why the whole sector coupling is so important. And then the mad thing about all of this, once again, is that this is not an idea or a philosophy or something that we're hoping to achieve. This is something that's already being done today. This is data from a district heating plant in Denmark from 4 years ago, where this connection between wind, large-scale electric boilers / heat pumps and thermal storage is already functioning on an existing energy market. And this is what makes this, in my opinion, such a low-hanging fruit opportunity. Proven technologies that we simply need to try and inform other people about and implement them. And this is the backdrop, you could say, to Heat Roadmap Europe, because of course, in order to do things like this, we need an awful lot of new, not just data and information, but methods and tools. And today we're going to learn a lot about the new data that we're developing in the project. So things like the new PETA tool is giving us more knowledge about the location of the heat demand, the amount of excess heat available, and so on. But in later work packages, we need to be able to develop the tools that can figure out, well, how much of this is actually possible to use, because it's not just about having the information, but then understanding how much value it can add to our energy system. So we're going to focus, you could say, very much today on the data, the new stuff that we've developed in the last year, but just to let you know that more is coming further down the road about how we can use this new opportunity. And as Paul said, Heat Roadmap Europe has been around a few years now. We first started in 2012, And the first 2 projects had an EU focus. We looked at the whole of Europe as if it was one country. So we had one energy model for all of Europe together. But in the last project, as I showed you, the 5 countries, we went down to a member state level and we considered 5 countries. And now in Heat Roadmap Europe 4, we're taking the biggest 14 countries in Europe to develop low-carbon heating and cooling strategies for them. So the PETA tool that you'll see after my presentation, there's a heat atlas available that covers each of these 14 countries. Even though it's only half the number of countries, because they're the 14 biggest, they account for 90% of the heat demand. And you could say whatever happens in these 14 countries is very much shaping the future of the EU energy system. I just want to wrap up with a few comments then about overall, even though, as I said today, we're creating data, in the future, our whole purpose is to create an evidence-based approach to long-term decision-making. So we're trying to make recommendations with some evidence to demonstrate how those recommendations can be easily implemented. And that all comes by quantifying, you could say, the impact of what we're trying to achieve. So that, you could say, is the broader objective of the Heat Roadmap Europe project. I won't go into it in too much detail, but as I mentioned, the work packages today that we'll focus on are work package 2 and 3 of the Heat Roadmap Europe project. So this is a flavour of what we're trying to develop. And as I said, in the next coming 2 years that the project is going on, there's a lot of other activities also about how to piece all of this information together so we get that holistic view. I'm just going to finish because I can't help but include this slide. This is the 3 cornerstones of all of our heat roadmaps that we've developed over the last 4 or 5 years. It also reflects back onto the point that Paul made about how it's not a silver bullet project where one technology fixes all our problems. We very much try to focus on what is the best combination of key technologies. And the 3 key recommendations that we've always had in most of our projects is that we need a very strong combination of heat savings in our buildings, district heating networks in our cities, and heat pumps in our countryside as the 3 cornerstones of a low-carbon heating system in the future. And today it's very much, you could say, about the district heating part because of the new PETA tool that we've developed, but it's let you know that there's a broader focus going on outside of the district heating one, very much developing new information about heat savings and heat pumps also. So I'm going to finish with just a slide in case any of you look at the presentation afterwards. There's links here to a lot of our activities. As Oksana said, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a Twitter page, a home page. You can follow what we're up to. There's a newsletter you can join. I'm really happy to see so many people here. It's a lot different to 4 or 5 years ago when we used to come to Brussels. So it's a nice change. And thank you all for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.